billionaire thought he had everything until a tired waitress, crawling on the diner floor with his son, showed him what he was truly missing. The city lights shimmered through the car window as Ethan Ward drove down the quiet road with his 5-year-old son. Caleb in the back seat. It was almost 8 in the evening, and the boy's head leaned against the window, his small hands clutching a red toy car. Ethan glanced at him in the rearview mirror and sighed softly. He wasn't used to spending time with his son alone. Between meetings, business calls, and endless travel, his days were full, but his life felt strangely empty. Ethan was a billionaire, a name people knew, respected, and feared in the corporate world. He owned towers, resorts, and half the city's commercial property. Everyone said he had everything a man could want. But right now, sitting in silence with his sleepy child, he felt awkward, almost like a stranger in his own life. He wanted to do something normal, something fathers did with their sons. Maybe have dinner together, just the two of them. "Are we going to the tall restaurant again, Daddy?" Caleb asked, his small voice breaking the silence. Ethan smiled faintly. "No, buddy. Not tonight. I thought we'd try something different." Caleb looked curious. "Like what?" Ethan turned the car into a small parking lot where a glowing neon sign read Daisy's Diner Homestyle Meals. It wasn't the kind of place he usually went to. There were no chandeliers, no valet parking, no fancy menus. Just a small building with the smell of coffee and fries floating through the air. But for some reason, it felt right. When they stepped inside, a bell over the door jingled. The warm smell of butter and syrup greeted them. A few truck drivers and families sat in booths, chatting quietly. Ethan felt slightly out of place in his expensive suit. But Caleb's eyes lit up at the sight of a jukebox in the corner. A cheerful voice called out, "Hi there. You two can sit wherever you like." Ethan turned to see a young woman in a waitress uniform carrying a tray of pancakes. She had kind eyes, her hair tied back messily, and a tired but genuine smile. She looked like someone who worked hard but still found reasons to be kind. Her name tag said Leela. They sat at a booth near the window, and Leela came over with a notepad. "What can I get you guys tonight?" Caleb grinned. "Do you have chocolate pancakes?" Leela laughed softly. "For breakfast lovers like you, we sure do." She leaned closer. "Whipped cream on top?" Caleb nodded eagerly. Ethan watched the exchange silently. Lila didn't just take the order, she crouched down so she could talk to Caleb at eye level. No waitress had ever done that before. Most ignored his son completely, talking only to him, the man with the wallet. "And for you, sir?" she asked, standing up straight. Ethan blinked, realizing he hadn't looked at the menu yet. "Just coffee and a club sandwich?" he said quietly, coming right up. She smiled and walked away, her shoes squeaking slightly on the old tile floor as they waited. Ethan glanced at Caleb, who was playing with his toy car on the table, driving it between the salt and pepper shakers. He wanted to talk to him, to ask about school or his favorite cartoon, but the words didn't come. He could negotiate million-dollar deals without hesitation. Yet he couldn't find the right way to talk to his own son. When Lila returned with their drinks, she noticed Caleb's car rolling toward the edge of the table. "Uh-oh," she said playfully, catching it before it fell. Caleb giggled, and she smiled. "You've got to watch those turns, race car driver." Caleb laughed so hard he almost spilled his milk. Ethan couldn't help but smile too. It was the first time all day he'd seen Caleb so happy. As they ate, Ethan watched Lila move from table to table. She seemed to know everyone. She refilled coffee for a tired truck driver, joked with a group of teenagers, and helped an elderly man cut his steak. She wasn't just doing her job, she cared. There was something genuine about her that Ethan couldn't ignore. Halfway through dinner, Caleb dropped his toy car, and it rolled under the booth. "My car," he gasped, sliding down from his seat. "Caleb." "Wait," Ethan started. But before he could react, Lila appeared again. Carrying a tray, she set the tray down on another table, then knelt beside Caleb. "Let's find that speedy little car together, okay?" she said. Caleb nodded, and the two of them got down on their hands and knees, peeking under the booth. Lila's hair fell out of her ponytail as she reached under the seat, laughing softly when she bumped her head. Caleb giggled, pointing. "It's over there." Ethan sat frozen, unsure what to do. The sight of a waitress crawling on the floor beside his sonite was strange, almost uncomfortable. He wasn't used to seeing people act this way around him. Most treated him with stiff politeness, afraid of making a mistake. But Lila didn't seem to care who he was. She just wanted to help a child find his toy. Finally, she pulled the car out and handed it to Caleb like it was treasure. "Found it." Caleb jumped up and hugged her legs. "Thank you." Lila smiled and patted his head. "Anytime, buddy. Just don't lose it again. We don't want to have to crawl under every table." Ethan felt something strange stir inside him. For a long moment, he just watched the warmth between a stranger and his son. It was simple, natural, and kind. Something he couldn't buy with all his money when she walked away. Caleb climbed back into his seat and kept talking about how nice Miss Lila was. Ethan listened, half smiling, half thoughtful. He realized he couldn't remember the last time Caleb had been this open with anyone, not even him. The rest of dinner passed easily. The diner buzzed softly with conversation and the clinking of dishes. Lila checked on them once more, making sure Caleb got extra whipped cream on his dessert. When she brought the bill, Ethan slipped a few large bills inside the folder, much more than the meal cost, as she came to collect it. She opened the folder, saw the money, and looked up at him, surprised. "Sir, this is way too much," she said. "I appreciate it, but I can't take that." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "It's just a tip." "You were great," she shook her head gently. "Thank you. But I don't want to take more than I earned." She smiled, again genuine, polite. But Furman set a few bills back on the table before walking away. Ethan stared after her, a little stunned. Most people he met either tried to impress him or take advantage of him. But Lila was different. She had dignity. As they left the diner, Caleb waved at her from the door. "Bye, Miss Lila." She waved back. "Bye, buddy. Drive safe." Outside, the night air was cool. Ethan helped Caleb into the car and looked at the glowing diner sign in the rearview mirror before driving off. Caleb was already half asleep, holding his toy car against his chest, a soft smile on his face. For a moment, Ethan thought about how strange the evening had been. He had gone in expecting a quiet meal and maybe a little father-son bonding. Instead, a tired waitress in a simple diner had reminded him of something he'd almost forgotten: how to be human. He couldn't shake the image of her on the floor, beside his son, laughing and searching for that tiny toy. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't elegant. But it was real. When they got home, he carried Caleb to bed and tucked him in. The boy mumbled sleepily, "Daddy." Lila was funny. Ethan smiled faintly. Yeah, she was. He stood there for a while watching his son sleep, his chest rising and falling softly. Then he turned off the light and walked to his study. The room was large, full of glass and steel, like everything else in his world. But tonight, it felt colder than usual. He poured himself a glass of water and looked out the window at the city skyline, the same skyline that had made him rich and powerful. Yet none of it gave him the feeling he'd seen on his son's face tonight. That laugh, that joy, that connection. For the first time in a long while, Ethan realized that maybe he had been chasing the wrong kind of success. And he couldn't stop wondering about the waitress from the diner, the one who had made his son laugh and, without meaning to, had made something inside him begin to stir. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about that night at the diner. It had been a week, yet the image of the young waitress crouching beside his son on the floor kept replaying in his mind. It was such a small thing, but it had left a mark on him. He had seen countless people try to impress him: employees, investors, and even friends. But no one had ever done something so genuine and simple. He wasn't sure why it affected him so deeply. Maybe because for the first time he had seen someone care about Caleb just for being a child, not because he was Ethan Ward's son. That night, he had noticed how icily Caleb laughed with her, how his eyes sparkled when she talked to him. It was something Ethan hadn't seen in a long time. Lately his son had become quiet, always sitting alone with his toys while Ethan was busy answering phone calls or staring at his laptop. Now, every time Caleb picked up that red toy car, he would say something about Miss Lila, the nice lady who helped him find it. On Friday evening, Ethan's driver was waiting to take him to a charity dinner downtown. But as he stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below, he felt an unusual hesitation. He looked over at Caleb, who was playing on the living room rug, pushing his toy car back and forth. "Dad," Caleb looked up. "Can we go back to that place with the pancakes?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The diner." Caleb nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I want to see Miss Leela again." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He had a room full of investors waiting to shake his hand, but the thought of another evening of polite smiles and fake laughter felt empty. He looked at his son again, and something in his chest softened. "All right," he said finally. "Let's go." When they entered Daisy's diner again, the bell jingled like last time. The place was busier tonight, filled with laughter and the smell of grilled burgers. Ethan noticed how the atmosphere felt different from the polished, cold restaurants he was used to. It was messy, yes, but it was real. Caleb scanned the room quickly, his small eyes searching. "She's not here," he said with a little frown. A middle-aged man behind the counter smiled and came over. "Evening, sir. Table for two." Ethan nodded and asked, "Is Lila working tonight?" The man looked up from his notepad, his smile fading slightly. "Ah, Lila, not tonight, no. Poor girl's been running herself ragged lately." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, curious. The man sighed. "She's been picking up extra shifts for months. Her little boy's been sick, and the hospital bills keep piling up. She's a hard worker, though. Never complains, just keeps going." Ethan sat down slowly, his chest tightening. He hadn't known she had a child. The thought of her smiling through exhaustion, helping customers while worrying about her sick son, unsettled him in a way he didn't expect. Caleb tugged on his sleeve. "Miss Lila has a son like me." Ethan nodded softly. "Seems so." Caleb smiled. "Maybe we can bring him pancakes too." Ethan didn't know what to say. He just looked at his son so innocent. So kind Dan felt a sharp sting of guilt. He had all the money in the world, yet he couldn't give his son what Lila had given him in a few minutes of kindness, attention, laughter, and warmth as they ate their dinner. He couldn't stop glancing toward the counter, half expecting Lila to appear with her tired smile. But she didn't. The diner felt emptier without her, even though it was full of people. After they finished eating, Ethan left another generous tip. This time the same man from the counter picked it up and said, "Sir Leela would probably tell you it's too much." That's the kind of person she is. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, I know." On the way home, Caleb kept talking about her again. "You think she's at the hospital with her boy?" he asked. "Maybe," Ethan said quietly, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "I hope he feels better," Caleb whispered, resting his head against the window. "She was really nice." Ethan glanced at his son through the rearview mirror. There was something about the way Caleb said it that made his throat tighten. Kindness. That was what was missing in his life. Not the money, not the power, but the gentle kindness that came from people like her. That night, after putting Caleb to bed, Ethan sat in his office, staring at the city skyline again. The glass. Walls of his penthouse reflected his own image back at him, polished, successful, but hollow. He thought of Leela working double shifts, probably exhausted, maybe skipping meals to save money for her son's medicine. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. For a brief moment, he considered finding her maybe offering to help, paying her bills, or giving her a job in one of his companies. But then he stopped himself. Why? Why do you even care this much? He barely knew her, and yet something about her honesty, her refusal to take the extra tip, her laughter with his son, it made her unforgettable. She had lived a life so different from his, yet in one evening she had shown him what truly mattered. Days passed, but she stayed on his mind, even asked one of his assistants to make a small donation to the local children's hospital anonymously. He told himself it was just a coincidence, but deep down he knew it wasn't. A few days later, he took Caleb to the park. They sat on a bench watching other kids play. Caleb was quieter than usual, rolling his toy car in the dirt. "Daddy," he said softly, "why don't you play with me?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "Play with you?" Caleb nodded. "Like Miss Leela did. She got on the floor and played with me." Ethan stared at his son for a long moment. He wanted to say he didn't have time or that his clothes would get dirty, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he sighed, set his phone aside, and got down on one knee in the grass. "Okay, race car driver. Let's see if I can keep up." Caleb laughed, his eyes lighting up. "Ready, set, go." For a few minutes, Ethan forgot about everything: his company, his phone, his image. He just laughed and chased a tiny toy car across the grass with his son. And as silly as it felt, it also felt right. When they got home, Caleb was still giggling. Ethan carried him upstairs and tucked him in. "You had fun today, huh?" Yes, Caleb nodded sleepily. "You're getting better at playing," Ethan chuckled. "That's good to know." As he turned off the light, Caleb murmured, "Miss Leela would be proud." Ethan froze for a second, looking at his son's innocent face. He didn't know why, but those words touched him deeply. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe the waitress, this ordinary woman he'd met by chance, had taught him more about fatherhood in one night than he'd learned in years. Later that night, Ethan went to his study again. But instead of opening his laptop, he just sat quietly. Remembering her words, "I don't want to take more than I earned." Most people he dealt with tried to take more than they gave. But not her. She had pride, dignity, and strength, even in her struggle. Ethan looked at a photo on his desk, him shaking hands with a senator, both smiling for the camera. The picture suddenly looked meaningless. He thought about how many times he had ignored real people because he was too busy chasing numbers. He thought of Leela serving coffee to strangers with a tired smile. He thought of her hands rough from work but steady when she helped his son. And for the first time, Ethan realized how small his world had become. Money had given him comfort, but not warmth. Power had given him control, but not peace. And yet, a waitress in a diner had managed to remind him that happiness wasn't something you could buy. It was something you created with love and kindness. As he looked out the window one last time before bed, he promised himself that next time he saw her, he wouldn't just be the man who left a big tip. He wanted to be the man who finally understood what really mattered. No, he didn't know it yet. That decision was going to change everything in his life soon, and in ways he could never imagine. A week passed before Ethan finally decided to take Caleb back to Daisy's diner. He didn't even tell himself why. Maybe he wanted to see Lila again. Maybe he just wanted another quiet evening with his son. But deep down, he knew it wasn't just about dinner. Something about that woman's kindness had stayed with him like a song, stuck in his head. As they drove through the soft drizzle that evening, Caleb kept peering out the window. "Do you think Miss Leela's working today?" he asked excitedly. "I hope so," Ethan said, smiling faintly. "You really like her, huh?" Caleb nodded. "She's nice. And funny. And she found my car." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head. "That's true. She's a real hero." When they reached the diner, the warm light spilling from the windows looked inviting. But the moment they walked in, Ethan felt something was off. The usual cheerful chatter seemed duller tonight. And the man at the counter, the same one who had mentioned Lila before, looked tired and worried. Ethan and Caleb sat in their usual booth. After a few minutes, Ethan asked, "Is Lila around tonight?" The man sighed, setting down the coffee pot. "You haven't heard?" Ethan's chest tightened. "Heard what?" The man leaned on the counter and spoke softly. "Leela got into a car accident 3 days ago. She was driving to the pharmacy to pick up her son's medicine when it happened. She's in the hospital." For a second, Ethan couldn't speak. Caleb stopped playing with his toy and looked up. "Miss Lila's hurt?" The man nodded sadly. "Yeah, poor girl. She's lucky to be alive, but her leg's broken. It's been hard for her. She doesn't have much family around." Ethan sat still, the words sinking in slowly. He pictured her laughing with Caleb, crawling on the diner floor to find his toy. He remembered her tired eyes, her polite refusal to take extra money. And now, she was in a hospital alone and hurt, while still worrying about her sick son. Something inside him twisted painfully. "Which hospital?" he asked quietly. The man looked surprised. "You want to visit her?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. Could you tell me where she's staying?" The man scribbled an address on a napkin and handed it over. She's at St. Mary's Hospital. Room 212. Ethan thanked him, grabbed Caleb's hand, and left without finishing his coffee. The hospital was a plain white building with flickering lights and the faint smell of disinfectant. As they walked through the quiet corridors, Ethan felt strangely nervous. He wasn't sure why he cared so much about someone he barely knew. Maybe it was because she reminded him of something pure, something he had lost. When they reached her room, Ethan paused at the door. Leela was lying in bed, her leg wrapped in a cast, her face pale but calm. She was reading a storybook to a small boy sitting beside her. The boy had thin arms and tired eyes, but when Lila smiled at him, he smiled back, and the room seemed to brighten. Ethan watched for a moment before knocking softly on the door. Lila looked up, startled. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Mr. Ward?" she said, trying to sit up. "What are you doing here?" Ethan stepped inside awkwardly, Caleb holding his hand. "We were at the diner. They told us what happened. We wanted to make sure you were okay." Leela blinked, clearly shocked. "That's very kind of you, but you didn't have to come." Caleb ran to her bedside. "Miss Lila, are you going to be okay?" Her face softened instantly. "Hey, race car driver. I'll be just fine. My leg's being lazy, that's all." Caleb giggled, but when he saw the cast, he frowned. "Does it hurt?" "Not too much now," she said gently. "I'm brave, remember?" Ethan stood quietly at the foot of the bed, unsure what to do with his hands. "We heard you were picking up medicine for your son," he said softly. "Is he okay?" The boy beside her looked up shyly. "I'm Jamie," he whispered. Ethan smiled kindly. "Hi, Jamie. I'm Ethan, and this is my son, Caleb." The two boys stared at each other for a moment before Caleb held up his toy car. "Want to play?" Jamie's eyes lit up. Yeah. In seconds, they were on the hospital floor, pushing the little red car back and forth, laughing. Ethan watched them, his heart tightening again. There was something so innocent about it, two children from completely different worlds, connected by something as small as a toy. Lila smiled weakly, watching them too. "He hasn't laughed like that in weeks," she said softly. "Thank you for bringing him some joy." Ethan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me. You're the one who made my son smile first." She looked at him, confused for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I'm glad he did. He's a sweet kid." Ethan hesitated before speaking again. "Lila, I'd like to help. I can cover your medical bills and your son's treatment. It's nothing for me, really." But she immediately shook her head. "No, please. I can't accept that. You've already done enough by visiting, Lila," Ethan said gently. "You're in no position to work right now. Let me do this. It's not charity. It's just help." Her eyes softened, but she still looked uncertain. "I don't want to feel like I owe anyone. I've managed so far on my own." Ethan nodded slowly. "I respect that. But sometimes, strong people deserve a little help too." For a moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them. She saw sincerity in him, something real beneath his calm, serious face. And for the first time, she didn't see him as a billionaire, just as a father who cared. Caleb and Jamie's laughter filled the room again. They were now crawling under the bed, pretending it was a tunnel. Leela laughed softly. "They're a handful," Ethan smiled. "Yeah, but seeing them like that, it feels good." He stayed for almost an hour, talking to her about simple things: the diner, the food, her dreams. She told him how she used to love painting before life got busy, and how she hoped to open a small bakery one day. Ethan listened carefully, realizing how long it had been since he'd had a conversation that didn't involve business or money. Before leaving, did her his card. "If you need anything at all, call me, even if it's just groceries or getting your son to school." She hesitated, then took it quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Ward," Ethan corrected gently. "Just Ethan." As he and Caleb walked back to the car, Caleb looked up at him. "Daddy, can we visit them again?" Ethan smiled faintly. "I think we will." That night, when Ethan put Caleb to bed, he couldn't stop thinking about Leela and Jamie. Their small, shared world inside that hospital room felt warmer than his entire mansion. He thought about the way Jamie smiled at his mom, the way Lila's eyes lit up when her son laughed. Despite her pain, she radiated strength. He sat in his office again, looking at the glowing city skyline. But tonight, it didn't impress him. The buildings he owned, the power he had, it all felt meaningless compared to what he had seen today. That small hospital room had something he couldn't buy: love, simplicity, and warmth. Over the next few days, Ethan quietly arranged for her hospital bills to be paid anonymously. He didn't tell her. He just wanted her to rest without worry. He also sent new toys to the pediatric ward, saying they were from a friend. When Leela found out later that her medical expenses had been cleared, she suspected Ethan, but said nothing. She just smiled to herself, touched in a way she couldn't explain. Meanwhile, Ethan began spending more time with Caleb. They cooked breakfast together, played board games, and even painted messy pictures that hung crookedly on the fridge. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to peace. He realized that meeting Leela had changed something in him. She had shown him that kindness didn't have to be grand. It could be as small as crawling on a diner floor or holding someone's hand in a hospital room, and though he didn't know what the future would bring, he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to let this connection fade away. Because for the first time, Ethan Ward, the billionaire who had everything, had finally found something money could never buy. The weeks that followed, Lila's accident brought slow but steady change into Ethan's life. What started as a single hospital visit turned into something much more. Ethan began stopping by every few days, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with food, and always with Caleb, who would quickly become Jamie's favorite playmate. The hospital nurses would smile when they saw the two boys running down the hallway, their laughter echoing off the walls. Ethan often stayed behind, sitting in the chair beside Lila's bed, talking with her about ordinary things. She told him about her small apartment, her struggles to make rent, and how she sometimes skipped meals so her son could eat. He listened, truly listened, not as a businessman analyzing problems, but as a man who cared. She asked about his work, and he tried to explain it simply, though it felt strange talking about billion-dollar projects in the hospital room that smelled of disinfectant. And hope, he started noticing small things about her: the way her hair curled behind her ear when she laughed, the tired lines under her eyes, and the strength in her voice when she talked about not giving up. She had a calmness that made him forget the chaos of his corporate world. When Lila was finally discharged, Ethan insisted on driving her and Jamie home. She argued at first, saying she could take a cab, but he wouldn't hear of it. "Please," he said with a smile. "Let me do something nice without turning it into a debate." She laughed and gave in. Her apartment was small, tucked in an old building with peeling paint and squeaky stairs. The furniture was mismatched, and the walls were covered with Jamie's drawings, bright, messy splashes of color that somehow made the place feel alive. Lila looked embarrassed as Ethan stepped in, brushing dust from a chair. "It's not much," she said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "It's home. That's what matters." Caleb and Jamie immediately ran to the corner of the room where a box of toy cars waited. Within seconds, they were building a racetrack out of books and pillows. Ethan watched them, his lips curving into a smile. "They get along like brothers," he said softly. Lila smiled too. "Yeah, Jamie hasn't had many friends. It's good for him." Ethan spent the whole afternoon there, helping fix a broken shelf and changing a light bulb that had been out for weeks. Lila tried to stop him, but he just laughed. "I'm not completely useless with my hands, you know." When it got dark, he finally stood to leave. Lila walked him to the door, and for a moment they stood there, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she said finally, "for everything. I don't know how I would have managed without your help." Ethan looked at her seriously. "You've managed your whole life, Lila. I'm just glad I could make it a little easier." After that day, seeing each other became routine. Sometimes Ethan dropped by with groceries. Other times, he took the boys to the park while Lila rested her leg. Slowly, their worlds started blending together, his world of luxury and her world of struggle. One Saturday morning, Lila invited them for breakfast. She insisted on cooking pancakes, saying, "You can't be eating fancy hotel breakfasts all the time." her small kitchen filled with the smell of butter and coffee. Ethan offered to help, but she handed him a whisk and said, "You can stir, but don't make a mess." Caleb and Jamie sat at the table, giggling as Leela flipped pancakes high into the air. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed this much. He found himself smiling without thinking, feeling like he belonged there, in that little kitchen with its chipped plates and happy noise. After breakfast, Leela poured him a cup of coffee and said, "You don't talk much about your wife." Caleb's mom. Ethan grew quiet. She passed away a few years ago. It was sudden. I buried myself in work after that. Lila's eyes softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been hard." He nodded, staring into his cup. "I thought keeping busy would help me forget, but it only made me forget how to live." Lila reached across the table and gently touched his hand. "You're doing better now? I can see it in the way Caleb smiles." Her words warmed him more than the coffee ever could. He looked at her hand resting over his and felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Comfort, connection, maybe even hope. Over time, they started spending even more time together. Ethan found himself canceling meetings just to drive Leela to her doctor appointments. Sometimes they would sit in the park while the boys played, talking about everything from childhood dreams to favorite movies. Lila had a way of making everything feel simple, no matter how heavy the subject was, but it wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension too. One evening, when Ethan offered to help pay her rent, she snapped, "I told you." "I don't want your money, Ethan. I can manage." He frowned, taken aback. "It's not about money. It's about helping a friend." "I don't want to feel like a charity case," she said quietly. Avoiding his eyes, he hesitated, realizing she wasn't angry out of pride, but out of fear of losing her independence. "Okay," he said finally. "No charity. Just friendship." She looked at him, her eyes softening again. "Deal." The next weekend, Lila taught him how to cook pancakes properly. He ended up spilling flour everywhere, and Caleb and Jamie laughed so hard they nearly fell off their chairs. Lila was laughing too, tears in her eyes. "You're hopeless," she said between giggles. "Hopeless but learning," he said, grinning. That night after they left, Lila sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt this light. For years her life had been a cycle of work, worry, and exhaustion. But now, there was laughter again, warmth again. She wasn't sure what to call what she felt for Ethan, but she knew it was something real. Meanwhile, Ethan lay awake that same night, thinking about her. He realized how much he looked forward to seeing her smile, hearing her laugh, or just being near her. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't expected to find someone who could make his world slow down. One evening, when he arrived at her apartment, the boys were building a blanket fort in the living room. Leela looked up from the couch, smiling. "You're just in time. They're about to declare it a castle." Ethan crouched beside them, helping tie the corners of the blankets. The boys crawled inside, giggling. "It's a double-decker fort," Caleb announced proudly. Leela laughed, watching them play. "You'd think they were building a palace." Ethan turned to her, smiling softly. "Maybe they are." When the boys fell asleep later, Leela and Ethan sat quietly on the couch, sipping tea. The apartment was dim, except for the soft glow from a lamp. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Lila said, "You've changed, you know. The man who first walked into the diner wouldn't have been caught sitting on my floor building forts." Ethan chuckled. "You're right. That man was missing a lot of things. What changed him?" She asked. He looked at her, his eyes steady. "You." Her breath caught for a moment, and she looked away. "Ethan." He didn't push. He just smiled softly and said, "I'm just glad we met." Outside, rain began to fall softly against the window. The boys were asleep in their blanket fort, and the two of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in thought. Ethan knew his life had shifted in ways he never expected. The billionaire who once measured life by profits and power now measured it by laughter, friendship, and small meaningful moments. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both felt it, the quiet pull of something deeper growing between them, something fragile and beautiful. It wasn't love yet, not fully, but it was getting close. As Ethan drove home that night, he glanced at Caleb sleeping in the back seat, still clutching his toy car. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. He realized that for the first time, he wasn't running from his past or hiding behind work. He was moving toward people who made him feel alive again. And somewhere in a small apartment across town, Leela sat by her window, smiling to herself. She didn't know where this new chapter would lead. She knew one thing for sure. Life had started to feel warm again, and she wasn't afraid anymore. Months had passed since that first dinner at Daisy's diner. Ethan's life had changed more than he could have imagined. The routine visits, the small moments with Caleb and Jamie, and the growing connection with Lila had shifted his world entirely. He found himself thinking less about business deals and more about the warmth of laughter in a small apartment. The sight of two children racing toy cars across a blanket fort, and the smile of a woman who had reminded him what truly mattered. One bright Saturday morning, Ethan decided it was time to invite Lila and Jamie to a special event at his company headquarters. He wanted to introduce her to a different side of his life, not to impress her, but to show her that she was important and that he wanted her involved. When he mentioned it to her, she looked uncertain. "I don't know, Ethan," she said, fidgeting with her sleeves. "Your world. It's so different from mine. I don't belong there." "You belong anywhere you choose to be," he said softly. "I want you to see where I work, the people I spend my days with. It matters to me that you're part of my life." Lila nodded, still hesitant but agreeing. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple dress that made her feel confident without being flashy. Jamie and Caleb were buzzing with excitement, and Ethan couldn't help but smile at how happy his son was. When they arrived at the headquarters, Lila's eyes widened at the gleaming glass towers, the polished floors, and the suits rushing past. She felt out of place at first, but Ethan stayed close, gently guiding her through the crowd. He introduced her to colleagues and investors, and she smiled politely, trying to appear confident. However, not everyone treated her kindly. During the networking event, one executive made a comment about her background, implying she didn't belong. Ethan's jaw tightened. He stepped forward immediately, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "Lila is exactly where she belongs," he said firmly, his voice carrying across the room. "She is one of the strongest, kindest people I know, and she reminds me what real courage and decency look like. Do not underestimate her." The room went quiet for a moment. Lila's face flushed, half with embarrassment and half with gratitude. She glanced at Ethan, surprised by his public support. For the first time, she realized that he truly saw her not as a waitress, not as a woman struggling to make ends meet, but as a person of value and strength. After the event, they walked to the car in silence. Lila finally broke it, softly saying, I didn't expect that. Thank you for standing up for me." Ethan smiled gently. "You deserve it, always." The ride home was quiet, but filled with a comfortable understanding. Ethan watched the city lights pass by and thought about how much his life had shifted. It wasn't just about the event or his public gesture. It was about how Lila had brought him back to life, how she had reminded him of the simple joys he had been missing for years. Back at her apartment, the boys were playing with blocks on the living room floor. Leela looked exhausted but happy. Ethan knelt beside the boys, helping them build a towering castle. Jamie laughed as Caleb added the final block, and Lila watched them with a soft smile. "Look at them," she said, almost to herself. "They're so happy." Ethan glanced at her. "They are, and it's because of you. You've given them more than I ever could." Lila shook her head. "No, you've given them the other half. You've shown them. Care, time, attention. It's not just me." Ethan reached out, taking her hand gently. "It's both of us. That's what makes it work." For a long moment, they simply held hands, their eyes meeting. There was no need for words. The bond they had formed over months of laughter, support, and shared moments was now undeniable. Later that evening, as the boys finally fell asleep in their blanket fort, Ethan and Leela sat on the couch, sipping warm tea. The apartment was quiet, lit only by a soft lamp, and for the first time, they felt completely at ease. Ethan took a deep breath. "Leela, there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, her heart beating faster. "What is it?" I care about you. More than I expected, more than I can put into words. You've changed me, shown me how to live again, how to feel again. I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." Lila's eyes filled with tears, a mixture of surprise, relief, and emotion. "Ethan, I feel the same way, but I've always been afraid. Your world is so different, and I never thought someone like you could care for someone like me." He smiled softly. "You're not someone like anyone else. You're Leela, and I want you with me, in my world and in my life. Not because I can give you things, but because I want you. Because being with you makes everything feel right." Her hand found his, gripping it tightly. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I want to try. I want to be with you." Ethan leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers. "Then we'll take it one step at a time, together." The following days were different. Their bond deepened, built on trust, care, and shared moments. They spent mornings at the park with Caleb and Jamie, afternoons cooking together, and evenings talking quietly about dreams, hopes, and fears. Ethan felt lighter, happier, and more alive than he had in years. One evening, he suggested something unexpected. "Let's go back to the diner," he said. Lila raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it's where it all began," he said softly. "Where you crawled on the floor to make a little boy happy. I want to remember that moment. I want to be there again, with both of our boys." When they arrived, the diner looked just as it had months ago. Caleb and Jamie ran to the booth, their laughter filling the air. Ethan and Lila sat across from them, smiling as they watched the boys play. Then, in a quiet, gentle moment, Ethan lowered himself to the floor beside the children. Crawling under the table as if nothing had changed since that first night, Caleb and Jamie laughed, delighted, and Leela joined in, crawling next to them, her laughter ringing bright and free. Ethan watched her, his heart full, realizing that life's greatest moments weren't found in skyscrapers or boardrooms, they were found on floors with children. In quiet kitchens, in laughter shared with someone you loved. As the evening ended, Ethan and Leela walked out of the diner hand in hand, the boys running ahead. He looked at her, smiling softly. "Everything's different now. I never expected this, but I'm glad it happened." Lila squeezed his hand. "Me too. Life feels right again." Ethan knew she was correct. His world had shifted completely. The billionaire who had once measured success in wealth and power now measured it in moments like this, in love, kindness, and laughter. And as they drove home that night, with the boys asleep in the back seat, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, Ethan knew that happiness wasn't something to chase. It was something to live, something to share, and something that grew in the simplest, most unexpected places. The diner, the hospital, a small apartment, these were the places where life truly mattered. And with Lila beside him, Caleb and Jamie laughing together, Ethan realized that he had finally found what he had been searching for all along: home, family, and love that no money could ever buy.